Okay, hopefully the audio works. I'm recording the training so that after today's training, you all get a copy of it so that you can then forward it to members of your staff who maybe couldn't make it today. But yeah, welcome to our training. We're very excited to be launching a victim services interpreter bank in Maryland. We've had a victim services interpreter bank, but in DC for over 4 years. And I'll be talking a little bit about the work that we've been doing in DC and then the work that we'll be doing in Maryland. But today, real quick, some of the things that we'll be touching upon are language access. What is language access? What does it mean and why is it important? I'll be giving you an overview about the kinds of services that are available to you and your clients through the Victim Services Interpreter Bank, which includes in-person interpretation, telephonic and video remote interpretation, document translation services. And then finally, I'll be talking a little bit about some of the reporting requirements that we have to meet and how that plays into the services that you'll be receiving through our bank, the data that we'll be collecting from you, and how you can provide feedback either about our services or feedback that you receive from your clients about our services. So language access, what is this term? What does it mean? Language access is just a term that describes the services that a nonprofit or any other agency can use to bridge a communication between any individual that doesn't speak, understand, read, or write English fluently. So it just, language access, through language access, you can ensure that any individual, regardless of the language that they prefer to communicate in, that they can access information, they can access programs, they can access your services at a level that is equal to someone who is English proficient, someone who is an English proficient hearing individual. And language access is important in the work that we do for many reasons. One of those reasons is we are, as service providers, legally obligated to provide language access services through different, federal laws, state laws, local laws. One of those laws is Title VI, which prohibits discrimination based on national origin. And then in Maryland, there's a local law called the Maryland Equal Access to Public Services, which applies to state agencies. And what that law basically says is that any agency that receives some sort of state funding, local funding, they have to take reasonable steps to provide equal access to services for LEP individuals. They're also required to translate any vital documents into the languages that are spoken by the LEP population that they serve, if that population represents 3% of the overall population of the people that they're serving. And it also requires agencies to provide oral language services. So in-person interpretation, telephonic interpretation. For deaf and hard of hearing individuals, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 exists to protect their rights as deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Nonprofits are considered to be Title III entities, and basically what that means is that when you are providing services to deaf and hard of hearing individuals, you have to provide services, you have to communicate effectively with those individuals. So again, there's that similarity between, providing services at a level equal to that of someone who does communicate speaking English fluently. And then we also have some ethical obligations. So if you're a therapist or a counselor and you're providing therapy, counseling, or any kind of service to an individual that does not communicate fluently in English, you want to make sure that you are communicating effectively with them, that they are understanding the services that they are being provided, that they're understanding the purpose of them going to therapy, the costs, any other risks that can be of consequence when they do seek these services. You want to make sure that your clients are being able to make their own choices as far as their recovery, their healing, all of that. And then there are these other considerations that are more, I want to say, on a grander scale. Like if there is a natural disaster, we would want to make sure that every citizen, in the state of Maryland can evacuate, not just the English-speaking individuals, but everyone, hard of hearing, deaf, individuals who speak other languages. Everyone should have access to healthcare and be able to receive healthcare in the language that they prefer. Everyone should be able to know how to respond to emergencies. So these are other considerations outside of our legal and ethical obligations. And then also, the state of Maryland has a very diverse population. Over 1.2 million people in Maryland above the age of 12 have hearing difficulty. They might be deaf and hard of hearing. And about 6.7% of residents in Maryland are limited English proficient. I mean, the probability of someone who needs interpretation and translation services coming to your organization to seek the services that they need, it's pretty likely that at some point you will, if you haven't already encountered someone who is LEP, is deaf and hard of hearing. And just to kind of close the loop on the picture of why language access is important, I think a lot of the times, we see it as simply providing an interpreter, simply providing, a document in their language, but it goes beyond that. And I wanted to share a story, but before I share the story, I always put a disclaimer, just because it is a sensitive story. It can be potentially traumatic for anyone in the room. So if you do feel like you need to step out afterwards, or if you want to step out now, you can. But I thought it was important to share the story of Daisy Garcia, who is the woman in the picture, and her two daughters. Unfortunately, all three were murdered by her ex-husband, who had been abusive towards Daisy and her daughters. Months before the incident happened, Daisy had gone to the police to file a report, and she wrote her report, and she wrote a statement in Spanish about the things that were happening at her home. The police never translated that statement into English, and so nothing came of her going to the police to file that report. Nothing was filed, no charges were placed against her husband, and unfortunately, he did murder them. But it just goes to show that a lot of the clients that you are seeing, they are coming from very dangerous situations, and so providing an interpreter could mean life and death for that person. They're fleeing danger, they're fleeing abuse, and so we as service providers have to make sure that we are not only meeting our legal and ethical obligations, but just, our humane obligations, we want to see our clients safe and out of these dangerous situations. Let's see. Okay. So now I'm going to move on and talk about Ayuda's Victim Services Interpreter Bank. So like I mentioned at the beginning, we've been in DC for over 4 years, and starting tomorrow, we'll begin serving Maryland nonprofits. So if you are a Maryland nonprofit and you have clients that live in DC and are a victim of crime, that live in Maryland and are a victim of crime, or if they don't live in Maryland but the crime happened in Maryland, you can receive free interpretation and document translation services from our interpreter bank. And currently, I think we have about 11 organizations that have already signed a memorandum of understanding with us. So starting tomorrow, they will be given access to all of these services. And if you have not yet signed an app and MOU, or if you haven't received one, just make sure to come talk to us before you leave, and we can provide you with some instructions on how we can get that process started. But because we've been in DC for over 4 years, we already have a pool of interpreters that's available to, go into Maryland and accept Maryland assignments. We have about 60, maybe a little bit over 60, who have taken our 4-day breaking silence training. And I'll be talking a little bit more about what that training covers. And these 60 interpreters, they work in over 12 languages. So if you need an Amharic interpreter, if you need a French interpreter, a Spanish interpreter, we have an in-person interpreter that can go to your office and interpret between you and your clients. For any languages that we don't cover with in-person interpretation, we do have telephonic interpretation available. And you can access a telephonic interpretation in almost any language. And for deaf and hard of hearing individuals, if you're unable to schedule an in-person interpreter, or you get a walk-in and you just want to make sure that you can communicate with them the next steps about like making an appointment, you can access a video remote interpreter through our bank. And these services are available to you 24/7, 365 days a year. For in-person interpretation, you can schedule things in advance, or say you have someone walk in who's in crisis and you need an in-person interpreter, you can submit a request for an in-person interpreter on what we call an emergency basis. And if they're available, they'll arrive on site. I'll talk a little bit more about what it means, what I mean when I say scheduled and emergency. And then lastly, we provide document translation services in just about any other language. All of the interpreters who work for our interpreter banks, before they're even able to sign a contract with our interpreter bank to begin working for us, they do have to meet certain criteria. Number one, they should have already taken a 40-hour foundation training. So we normally don't contract with individuals who are just bilingual individuals with no training. We only contract interpreters who already have years of experience in the field and who have taken this 40-hour foundation training where they learn the basic skills of how to be an interpreter. They must pass or present proof of having passed a proficiency test in all of their working languages. So if they interpret in 3 languages, we need to see proof from those 3 languages that they are at a satisfactory or high level or superior level of proficiency. And then finally, they do have to take one of our trainings or a training that is equivalent to one of our trainings. So for the Victim Services Interpreter Bank, one of the trainings that can qualify an interpreter to work for the bank is Breaking Silence, which is a 4-day training. And that training covers, interpreters learn how to interpret for victims of crime. They learn about how to provide victim-centered and trauma-informed interpretation. So you'll be getting an interpreter that knows how to, manage and deal with situations that can come up when you are providing services to someone who has been a victim of crime. If they break down or if they switch between languages, when they're sharing their story, our interpreters will be able to effectively manage and navigate through those situations. They learn about vicarious trauma that can sometimes happen when they're interpreting in these situations and how to take care of themselves and make sure that, they are not re-traumatizing the client or re-traumatizing themselves. And then just in general, they learn the victim services vocabulary that is necessary for them to know. And the training is a 4-day training. It's very extensive. They do a lot of role playing. And this training, it's good for them to take it because, like I mentioned, you'll be getting an interpreter that can navigate through these sensitive issues. This data right here is data from our DC Victim Services Interpreter Bank, just to give you an idea of the kind of volume that we see. And I think this covers a year. So in 1 year, we provided interpreters in 433 instances in the languages that are up on the screen. So that's Amharic, Spanish, French, ASL. We provided telephonic interpreters in 622 instances. And that number will always be higher than in person because a lot of the times it's just a quick call. Like, are you still coming to the appointment tomorrow? Yes, great. So that number will always far exceed in person. And then we translated 112 documents. Any questions so far? No. All right.
About this translation for documents.
Yes.
What kind of documents and I don't know if you're going to
Oh yeah, we are. Yeah, we're gonna get to it. Yeah.
I have a question about the training also,
Mhm.
in terms of the mentioned the trauma-informed elements of the interpreter training, and that's excellent. You mentioned that, you know, how to handle situations where the client breaks down, and I know you have the best practices flyer also that emphasizes the importance of talking to the provider beforehand for mental health encounters with victims or survivors. Is there any discussion in your training about things like a client dissociates while speaking, or is that something we would work with a lot of survivors in the program, and extreme harm, sexual and gender-based violence. So, but that's just it's good to know if when working with someone for the first time as an interpreter, is that something that the provider should pretty much always be sure to, you know, talk about. What if that happens? The person just goes into, you know,
that's a good question.
I'm going to come up here so that the audio catches me. And I'll just sort of repeat your question briefly for the audio. Yeah, so the question was kind of around whether the training goes into depth about like if scenarios in which a client might disassociate, or, you know, different scenarios that might happen. So one disclaimer I'll give is that we don't actually provide the interpreter training because we're not interpreter trainers. So we contract with professional interpreter trainers, and the team that's going to be doing it in May has a lot of victim services background. One of the trainers is from Deaf Hope. It's an organization in California that trains sign language interpreters. And then the other part of the team is from Casa de Esperanza, from National Latina Network. So they have a lot of victim services experience. We've done the training about 4 or 5 times. In the past, we haven't necessarily done a scenario where the client is disassociating, but we do go through like the tenets that the interpreter should keep in mind, such as sort of like taking the cues off of the provider, you know, the mental health services provider, and you know, and not sitting with silence, right? The interpreter shouldn't be offering the client tissues. The interpreter shouldn't be trying to console the client. I mean, those are things that are completely within the realm of what the service provider decides is appropriate or isn't appropriate, or is going to facilitate, you know, communication and safety, you know. And so I think that the interpreters learn sort of broad techniques for making sure that they are not re-triggering, you know, the client, and that they're taking cues off of the service provider. So, you know, it's the curriculum is on our website. The manual and the workbook are on our website, and you can see what are some of the things that we go through. The scenarios are in the workbook, and sort of the themes are in the manual. But it's something like a 300-page manual, and it was created by Cross Cultural Communications here in Maryland. So yeah, you know Marjorie Bancroft, and yeah, so it's a fantastic resource, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it. Yeah. Yeah. We certainly talk about interpreter ethics and sort of the protocols, and if there does need to be some sort of a mediation where they interrupt, like how to do so in an appropriate manner when it is a trauma setting. But yeah, it's an amazing curriculum, and it's a 4-day training. It's really fantastic. Yeah.
I have another question.
Hi, yes, thanks. Totally going to check out the curriculum. I'm glad it's available. I just want to ask quickly, do you know any of the scenarios or any of the discussion during the training address working or interpreting for someone with intellectual disability?
I don't think that it does, no.
Yeah, the question was about intellectual disabilities, whether any of the scenarios cover that. I don't think they do. What I'll say about the training is that when we created the curriculum, it was about 4 or 5 years ago, you know, Marjorie did a bunch of phone calls with victim service providers in DC, a bunch of focus groups with victim service providers in DC. She tried as much as possible to get sort of like real life scenarios. You know, we didn't necessarily cover every scenario, but we are having an interpreter training in May, and the trainers this time around are doing some updates. So if you have suggestions, or you would be willing to speak with the curriculum developer, like, we'd be happy to put you guys in contact with her and see whether we can sort of include some of the scenarios that you guys think would be most applicable to the work here in Maryland, because that's who we're training in May, is interpreters who will be doing the work for you guys in Maryland. So yeah, we'd be, you feel free to get a hold of us about that.
All right. So now we'll be talking about how to request an in-person interpreter. And the way that our current providers through our other banks request interpreters is through our online scheduling system called Salesforce, which I'll be demonstrating in just a few minutes. I did want to quickly just give you a few disclaimers. One, Salesforce, there's only one account per organization. So tomorrow, if your organization has signed an app and MOU, we'll be creating your account and activating it. And what that means is whoever you listed as the first point of contact on your application, they'll receive an email address with a link that'll prompt them to create a password. And then once they create that password, they'll be able to log in, start submitting requests, and we'll be instructing them to share that password with anyone else in your organization that needs to submit a request. Some organizations decide to have one person submit all of their requests for the organization, and then other organizations just give access to everyone within their organization, and then everyone just submits their request. So we leave that decision to the organizations. On Salesforce, you'll be able to check the status of your requests and also canceling requests. And we'll be going over specialty requests, or what we call specialty requests, and how to submit those requests, because Salesforce, even though it's a wonderful system that is fairly, I wouldn't say user-friendly, but it's fairly user-friendly. It doesn't always do a great job at handling like requests for a team of interpreters. So we'll be talking about how to submit those requests.
If we have an account already for DC,
Yep, same thing. So in your folders, you have a Salesforce guide, a step-by-step Salesforce guide. In the front, there's a table of contents that will direct you to, whatever question that you have. You can go to that page, read those instructions. To access Salesforce, rather than going to salesforce.com, you'll want to go to interpreterbank.force.com/login. And when you go to that URL, this is what you'll see. Your organization's username will be interpreter at whatever your organization's email address is. So for Ayuda, for example, it would be ayuda.com. And then type in your password, log in, and when you log in, this is what you'll see. This is called, this is the dashboard. This is where you will find everything that you need to know about requests that you've submitted, requests that have already occurred, requests that have been accepted by an interpreter, or requests that are still pending because an interpreter hasn't logged on to accept your request. Your dashboard, for some of you, your dashboard will look exactly like this. Like you'll have these two tabs, you'll have this dashboard tab, you'll have a section called active victim bank requests. The only difference is it'll be blank because you haven't submitted requests yet. And then you'll have another section called completed victim bank requests. For other organizations who have MOUs through our other banks, your dashboard is gonna look different. Like you might have 4 tabs instead of, these 2. You might have 6. So just keep that in mind. Your dashboard might look a little bit different. But for the most part, this is what it will look like. Right here, there's a drop-down menu. For example, if you're only seeing like 5 of your requests, but you submitted another one or a series of requests and they're not showing up, you can just go to this drop-down menu to show you your other requests. You can sort by all of these different columns just by double-clicking on those arrows right next to the column names, and you can sort by case number. You can sort by requester name, like if you wanted to, if you couldn't remember whether you submitted a request, you could sort by your name, you could sort by the time and date of session. You can sort by pretty much every column. When you scroll to the left of the screen, I think for you it's the left, and for me it's the right, there's a column called status. If the status of a case is pending, it means an interpreter has not logged on to accept your assignment yet. If the status is pending for all interpreters to accept, what that means is your request is a team assignment request, and one, maybe two interpreters have logged on to accept it, but we're still waiting for another interpreter or two other interpreters to accept your request. So it means your request is partially filled, but not filled yet. And then the other status that you'll see when an interpreter does accept your assignment is covered assignment. And when an interpreter logs on to accept your request, the status of your request will change to covered, and then the requester of the request and the on-site point of contact will get a confirmation email with the interpreter's name, phone number, and email address. And if it's a team assignment, it'll be all of the interpreters' names and contact information. If you wanted to view details about your request, you could click this view button. This one is empty because I think this is one of our test requests. To cancel a request, you would just click that cancel button. And what that'll do is it'll alert the interpreter. It'll send them an email and tell them that the assignment has been canceled. And if it's an assignment that's canceled with short notice, it'll have Salesforce begin all of the steps for that interpreter to receive payment for the last minute cancellation. So we always recommend that if you do need to cancel, that you first log on to Salesforce and cancel, because then Salesforce will do the next steps that it needs to do in an automated fashion. Rather than like emailing the interpreter and then emailing us, this is the best way to cancel an assignment. So now I'm going to show you the interpreter request form. So say I wanted to submit a request for today for an interpreter. I'm going to go ahead and click this Victim Bank interpreter request for DC/Maryland client. This is what the interpreter request form looks like. All of the fields that are in red are required fields. So the system will not let you submit any requests if you do not fill in all of the required fields. I don't think I'm going to go through the entire form because I do think it's fairly like self-explanatory, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. So for language, if I go to the language drop-down menu, you'll see a list of languages. And the list of languages that you see are languages for which we have an in-person interpreter. So if you ever have questions about, do we have a Swahili speaking interpreter? You can go to the request form and then search right here, and we do. When you are selecting a language, don't select Echo language because that's our test language, and I think David will get your requests. Also, if you are selecting a language, don't select CDI because CDI stands for Certified Deaf Interpreter. They are interpreters who are deaf, who always work in a team with a hearing American Sign Language interpreter. So if you know that your client uses sign language and that they need a certified deaf interpreter, you would first select ASL. And when you do that, you'll get the option, it'll ask you, do you also need a CDI? And then when you check that box, it'll send the assignment out to all of our sign language interpreters, the hearing ones and the deaf ones. If you're working with a client that has a preference for a male interpreter or a female interpreter, you can request that on the request form. Just keep in mind that in selecting a gender, you are limiting the pool of interpreters that are able to accept the assignment. But if that's what your client prefers and needs, you are more than welcome to select a gender for the interpreter. Let me use this as an example. Say that you today met with a client and David was your interpreter. And David did a fantastic job interpreting for you and your client. Your client feels comfortable. And before the session is over, while you have your client and David in the room, you schedule a follow-up session. And David says, yes, I'm available. I can come on site to interpret. We encourage those interactions between our providers and our interpreters because we do think it's important for the healing journey of your clients, you know, having consistency in the services that they're being provided. And so on the system, the way you would specifically request that interpreter is by first selecting the language that the interpreter interprets in. And once you select the language, then you'll be able to see all of the interpreters, the names of the interpreters who interpret in that language, and you can select the interpreter that you want to work with. And what Salesforce will do is it will only send that request to that one person. And so they'll know that they're expecting to receive a request from you, and then they'll quickly log on and accept the assignment. That feature should only be used when you've already verbally or through written communication confirmed the interpreter's availability. Otherwise, if the interpreter didn't know that, you know, you wanted to work with them for the follow-up session, they might just ignore the email that they receive and not accept your assignment. And the assignment won't get filled because the request will only be received by that one interpreter versus everyone else. So it just makes it more difficult for us to try to fill your assignment with another interpreter that could be available. So please, as much as possible, only use that feature when you've already received some sort of confirmation from the interpreter. And I believe if you hover over these question mark icons, it'll provide you with instructions as to like when you should be using those features. Here we go. You can also exclude interpreters from receiving your requests. And you can exclude interpreters for a variety of reasons. It could be that you worked with that interpreter before and they weren't a good language match for your client. Or your client has a conflict with that interpreter and you know that beforehand. Or hopefully this doesn't happen, the interpreter did not do a good job interpreting between you and your client and you don't want to work with that interpreter again. You can exclude interpreters from receiving your requests. And the way you do that is, let's say I wanted to exclude these two interpreters from receiving my request. I can just click on one, hold the shift button, click on the other, click this arrow right there, and those interpreters won't receive your requests. If you do have an unsatisfactory experience with our interpreters, do let us know so that we can ask you questions, get down to the root of the issue, and potentially have a conversation with the interpreter in the hopes of making sure that you have a better experience next time with that interpreter. And it's important for us to know because it might be that interpreter's third strike. And so we would consider terminating our contract with them. So if you do ever have an unsatisfactory experience, please let us know. Let's see. Okay. Short description of session. This field, everything that you type in this field is what the interpreter will receive in the first email notification about the assignment's availability. So it's important for you to be as specific as possible so that the interpreter can prepare for the assignment or can make a decision as to like whether they're comfortable accepting the assignment or qualified to accept the assignment. So typing in just like client meeting doesn't really tell the interpreter what they're walking into. So just provide as much detail as you can, keeping in mind that this information is sent to all of the interpreters. So you might not want to include like a client's name, but as much detail as possible, like therapy session between therapist and client who has been traumatized or is a victim, survivor of domestic violence. We'll be doing some exercises, as much detail as possible. Now, lastly, I want to go over these two last questions right here because they're going to determine whether you can submit your request or whether there's more data that you have to fill out. So the first question is about eligibility. If I select DC victim/DC crime, Salesforce won't allow me to submit the request because currently my organization doesn't have an app and MOU to access the services for my DC clients. But if I select Maryland victim of crime, I'll be able to submit my request because I do have an app and MOU for that. And then Salesforce is going to ask me about whether I've already provided demographic and victimization data, either through Salesforce or through our telephonic interpretation service or document translation service, whether I've provided information about this client through any of those other systems in this quarter. Is everyone in here a Maryland VOCA grantee? So for the most part, you're familiar as to the quarters? Okay, awesome. So say that I did already give this data through a telephonic interpreter. If I select yes, I can just submit my request because we have that data. But if I select no or I don't know, then I'll be asked a few other questions, data collection questions. And the reason why we ask these questions is because they are a grant requirement. And having this data has actually been useful for us in knowing, like, you know, we know that this percentage of individuals have been a victim of adult sexual assault. So maybe we need to better prepare our interpreters in that, you know, area. Like this data outside of our grant requirements is also useful for us to have. So just keep in mind, if you did not submit this data anywhere else, you might be asked a couple of other questions.
Quick question for requester up
Mhm.
top. So if your organization has multiple people who are doing, so do they have to have been on the snowshoe, or can anyone, once they log in?
Yep.
Anyone can?
Yes. So once your organization has an account, if your organization has decided to distribute the username and password to everyone in your organization, then anyone in your organization can
So they
log
can
on.
put their full name, they don't have
Yeah.
to put their name.
Yeah.
And the application that you guys filled out, when you put points of contact on there, that's mainly like we'll use those to send out emails. Like we're closed for the snowstorm tomorrow. You know, everyone be aware of our inclement weather policy. Like we'll send it to the points of contact from your application. But yeah, those aren't the only people who could use Salesforce. Yeah.
So the email could go to them, that
Mhm.
colleague.
Yeah. And then one thing I'll mention is if the requester is also the on-site point of contact, you can click this button called requester is on-site point of contact and it'll just auto-populate everything. Yes.
Sorry, a question. We don't receive, our program doesn't receive direct funding right now from VOCA. I just wanted to go back and ask about the type of victimization
Okay.
labels. And so I wonder, are torture survivors there or?
It's not, you have to put other.
Right, and I didn't know if when you get put in other, is there a space to put in the specific type?
Yeah. Unfortunately, with our system, no. You would just select other. If you wanted to provide us with that data, like you could, but on Salesforce currently, there's no way for you to type in details about when you select other. Yeah.
And I just wanted to mention that that question where we say, have you already provided us information about this client for this quarter? That's just something that you guys are expected to keep track of. So if you have some sort of a client database, you know, if you could put in the client notes, like already entered in, you know, demographic information for this client in Salesforce this quarter or whatever, it'll help you. Of course, if you aren't able to keep track of it, you can always choose, I don't know, and we'll just collect the information. You know, our default is that if there's any doubt, then we'll collect the information and report it to the Office of Victims of Crime.
Yes.
So I haven't reviewed the memorandum of understanding, but in terms of confidentiality, is there a component to it because we're sharing data with you? Yeah,
So we ask for the client's name, and that does not go out to all of the interpreters when we are looking for an interpreter who's available for the assignment. It only goes to the interpreter who will fill the assignment. Once they accept the assignment, they'll get the client's name, and that's for conflict check purposes to make sure it's not a relative or, you know. But then with regard to the data you're entering in here, we don't associate this data with the client. We provide it to the Office of Victims of Crime just in bulk. And then with regard to the safety of the data, you know, it's Salesforce is a secure site.
So, in your experience, have you signed any confidentiality agreement with
with the interpreters? Yes.
with the interpreters and with the agencies that are or have you had that experience, or how are they handling that? Just brainstorming, I guess.
Yes. Well, our interpreters, part of their contract is a confidentiality agreement. So they do have to sign that. And we also welcome organizations to send confidentialities to our interpreters if you'd like for them to sign one before they arrive on site. Language Line, which is the vendor that we use for telephonic interpretation, I believe they also have confidentiality agreements with their interpreters. And then our translation vendors, I believe, also have confidentiality agreements with their translators, with the people that are translating the documents. Yeah.
I have a related question. In the past, we've used a couple of different sorts of interpreters, including the IRC's interpreter service, ADASTRA. We never provide, on a request, we never provide, we provide the name of the therapist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's to protect the client, and we get information releases between us and the therapist.
Yeah.
But we don't have an information release from the client to share their name with anyone else except, and we have had experiences, unfortunately, with just a few interpreters where some of them do not seem to have had a high level of training.
Mm-hmm.
So, because we're working with people who also have been victimized here as well as overseas, and sometimes there are people who have experience with informers.
Yeah.
We are very careful about that, and I don't know if that is like a deal breaker, because we would not want to share.
Yes. So one suggestion that I make, because we do work with shelters who might be hesitant to type in their clients' names on our request form, what we suggest is you can type NA for client name, because again, Salesforce won't let you submit a request unless there's something in that field. And then they can call the interpreter and do the conflict check over the phone. So at the very least, there's nothing in written communication.
You can also choose not to do a conflict check. The danger is that the interpreter might show up and say, oh, that's my cousin's husband, or that's my cousin's wife. I can't interpret. And then you won't have the ability to hold the session. And we'll end up paying the interpreter for their having gone. So we would leave it to your discretion. I mean, this is obviously tricky, right? The whole question of like how to pair the interpreter with the victim. One thing I would say is when you get a confirmation email from us and you learn who the interpreter is, you certainly want to share that information with the victim. Do you know this person? This is the person who's going to be interpreting. Are you comfortable with this person interpreting? And they'll hopefully say, I don't know that person, or, and then, so it can go both ways. You can get the conflict check to be done from the perspective of the interpreter and also from the client. The other thing that you mentioned, I think that is important is really, I think you guys should be concerned about whether you have the permission of the client to put their name into the system. And, perhaps you ask for their permission first and then you put it into the system, or you put unknown or you put NA or confidential, and you do the conflict check some other way, or you don't do the conflict check and you take the risk of their showing up and not being able to fulfill the assignment, or you use a telephonic interpreter if you're concerned about the community being very small and you think, that it's likely that the interpreter is going to have some connection to the victim or go to the same church or, have seen them before. So it is definitely a sensitive topic. Yeah.
You mentioned that you use the language line for the telephonic translation. Do those translators go through the same 4-day training? And with that, do they have the cultural competency to have issues in the past?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think so. Which is why we suggest only using language line when you absolutely have to meet with the client but cannot get an in-person interpreter, because more often than not you'll be submitting requests for an in-person interpreter. If it's a language that we don't cover, you can reach out to us. We might have former interpreters on a list that we can contact who might be available, but no, I don't think the language line interpreters have the same level of training. For deaf and hard of hearing clients, we were sent a resource that we can send to everyone. It's a video relay interpreting service, and I believe that the interpreters that are providing the interpretation have some sort of trauma-informed training, not our breaking silence training, but they have some sort of trauma-informed training. So we can definitely forward that as a resource if there's ever a situation where you can't get an in-person interpreter from us. And I believe the service is free. Yeah.
Your PR is only ASL, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the like video interpreting could be in other languages. You know, you could use a Spanish interpreter through video, but for us, we're only offering the video remote interpreting for sign language interpretation.
So just American.
And just
Yes.
American
Yeah.
Sign Language, yes.
I think it's in Canada.
Yes, yeah. For other sign languages like Ethiopian Sign Language, our service doesn't have that ability. It's just American Sign Language. Yeah, the video part. But we do have an in-person Ethiopian Sign Language interpreter.
All right. Yes.
So our coalition is a direct service provider. It supports other providers. So our main need is translation written.
Mhm.
Do we need an MOU and do we use the same request process?
Yes. You do need an MOU, and then you would still use Salesforce, but you would use our translation request form.
Reporting back how much we do or
We can provide that on request. We can run reports and send you requests on your organization's usage.
And if you look at the translation request tab, it'll ask if this is outreach materials. And if so, it won't ask you the demographic information. You won't have to worry about entering that in. Yeah.
But we'll go over the translation request form. Uh-oh. David, I think there's a glitch. We'll go over the translation request form later in the presentation. I do want to talk about a couple of other things related to submitting in-person interpreter requests. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Some of the items on this slide are probably more relevant to organizations that have submitted requests through our interpreter banks in the past, but I thought it was still useful to mention them at this presentation. Some of the common mistakes that we see when requests are submitted through our system, one of those things is selecting a specific interpreter that you didn't verbally or through written communication confirm with. When canceling requests, not going to Salesforce to cancel them, and then we don't find out about that cancellation until like a month after the request because you canceled over the phone or canceled through email and the interpreter didn't, send us that communication, or canceling the wrong request. If you noticed on the dashboard, every request had a case number. We do ask that you try as much as possible to keep track of that number when you are asking questions about requests, because we receive a high volume of requests that might be happening same date, same time, maybe even same location. So if you tell us, hey, I have a question about the request I submitted for tomorrow at 12 p.m. In Silver Spring, we'll say, well, which one? Because there's a whole bunch happening at your organization at that time. So just keeping track of the case number when you are asking questions about requests. When you submit your requests, just take a couple extra minutes to make sure that the information that you've entered is correct. One of the most common mistakes that we see is wrong date and time. Right now on Salesforce, you don't have the option to edit requests. So if you do, save your request and then you notice that there's an error, just send us a quick email so that we can edit it on our end and just confirm that the interpreter is available for whatever the correct date and time of the request is. Inside of your packets, you have a form that's called a signature form. When an interpreter arrives on site at your organization to interpret, after the session is over, they will be handing you this form for you to sign to confirm that they were on site for the amount of time that is on the form. Make sure that you are reviewing the form carefully, that there is a clear start time, a clear end time, and that you're signing off on their form, because that is how we decide how much to pay them. So if they were only on site for an hour, but they wrote that, they were actually on site for 4 hours, Like, you might not want to sign off on that form because we'll pay them for 4 hours. And, you know, we have our own terms with our interpreters, but just quickly take a look at the form and make sure that the start time is correct, the end time is correct. They might tell you, oh, even though it was only 2 hours, I still get paid for 4 because the estimated duration was 4 hours. Like, those are terms that we've negotiated with them, which is fine, but still just sign off on accurate information.
Again, it varies a little bit. If an appointment, say, is supposed to start at 2 o'clock, should the interpreter be requested to come at 1:45? Because with some agencies, when you request a 2 o'clock appointment, they are in principle, you know, the organization says how to.
Mm-hmm. So I think our confirmation email says the requester will follow up with the interpreter if they would like the interpreter to arrive 15 minutes early. I think that's what the confirmation email says. That being said, like, I think it's up to you. Like, we recommend that you touch base with the interpreter before the session occurs, just to make sure that they know what time to arrive, if they need to bring an ID with them to go through security, or if there are details about the session that you want to let them know before they arrive. We do think it's a good idea for you to have a pre-session. That can happen, you know, 15 minutes before the actual session. You can ask them to arrive 15 minutes early. But yeah, that's up to you. We also encourage that from our interpreters. Like, you should reach out if you have any questions about the session. But I think it's up to the provider. If you would like the interpreter to arrive 15 minutes earlier, they can, and they'll receive payment for that time. Yeah. If you want them to stay late, that's also a possibility for either a debrief, and they will also get paid for that time.
How long would it you assign another one?
Okay. So the question was, if your client has a conflict with the interpreter that they first worked with, how much time will it take for us to find an alternate interpreter? So is your question like after the session is over or before? Well, our interpreters, we ask our interpreters to let us know when there is a conflict. That way we can remove them from the assignment, and we can then send the request out to all of the other interpreters that would potentially be available. It depends on the language. I mean, here's what I will say. Most often than not, you will receive a confirmation email the same day that you submit your request. If it's for Spanish or Amharic. Some other languages are a little harder to fill and will require a little bit more of our attention. For example, Tigrinya. We only have, I think, like 3 Tigrinya interpreters right now. So those can take a little longer. If you ever have a question about the status of your request, like if you submitted a request last week and you're scheduled to meet with your client tomorrow and you still haven't received anything from us, contact us a few days before your scheduled appointment, and we can provide you with an update about what we've done, or we can, respond and say, I'm sorry, we don't think we'll be able to fill this request. Please use a telephonic interpreter or reschedule. The reason why we can't always proactively notify you about the statuses of your requests is because of the volume of requests that we receive. So always be encouraged to reach out to us if you do have questions about your requests. Some other requests do take a little longer to fill because it might not be a language that's hard to reach, but it could be a team interpretation assignment, which requires us coordinating between different schedules. So just keep in mind for team requests, it might take us maybe a week to fill your request. And so jumping off of that point, with as much notice as possible, please submit your requests. Obviously, if a client is in crisis and they only let you know 3 hours ago that they wanted to come in for an emergency counseling session, you're able to submit those requests on our system.
You need when you need American Sign Language and a speaker of another of the language, or something like
Mhm.
where sometimes we need 4 interpreters?
Yes.
Same thing.
Yes. So when I talk about team assignments, I'm referring to different things. So one form of a team assignment is American Sign Language. So for any session that is longer than 60 minutes, you will need 2 interpreters. If your client needs a CDI, you'll need a team of 4 if it's a session that's longer than an hour. Or if it's an hour-long session and you need a CDI, it'll still be 2 interpreters. So just keep in mind, if your client needs a CDI, you'll probably get 2 interpreters. If the session is longer than an hour, you'll either get a team of 2 or 4 interpreters. So that's one kind of a team assignment. If you do foresee needing a team of interpreters, rather than going on Salesforce, contact us first so that we can guide you through how to submit that request on the system. Or we might decide this is really complicated to submit on your end, let us handle it on our end. So that's one team assignment. Another team assignment is if you are having a group counseling session, your session might go a lot more smoother if we provide simultaneous interpretation. And usually with simultaneous interpretation, you do need a team of 2 interpreters and the use of equipment. We have equipment that we can send with the interpreters for you to use. And so that request, I think on Salesforce right now, there's no way for you to request simultaneous interpretation. So if you do need a simultaneous interpreter, instead of going on Salesforce, just send us an email. Or if you forget to send us an email, at the very least, just type it in the description because we'll see that and we'll say, oh, this is a simultaneous interpretation assignment. We need a team. We need equipment. And we'll know to follow up with you to get other details. If you have, in one session, I'm thinking of one of our providers right now that has a group session where there are 2 languages represented other than English in that session. So we're actually providing 2 interpreters in Spanish, 2 interpreters in French, and simultaneous equipment. All of that is to say, if you need a team of interpreters, I feel like I'm rambling. If you need a team of interpreters, don't go to Salesforce, just come to us and we'll guide you through how to submit that request on Salesforce. Yeah. All right. Okay. Awesome. Make sure. Okay. Now, when an in-person interpreter is not available, you do have access to LanguageLine. And in your folders, you should have a step-by-step instruction on how to access LanguageLine. For some of you, if you look at step 4 in that top section, for some of you, that line will be blank. For others, you'll have a number there, and that's because your organization, we have an MOU on file with your organization already. So you could start using a telephonic interpreter today if you wanted to. For those that are blank, it just means we don't have an MOU yet. But again, I'll be going over at the end how you can contact us so that we can get that process started. But the process for using LanguageLine is pretty simple for the most part, except when it comes to data collection, which unfortunately is not, something we can bypass. But after you dial the LanguageLine number and after you dial the client ID number, which tells LanguageLine that it's a call coming that should be billed to us. And then after you dial the number that you need for the language that you need and provide the access code that's specific to your organization, the call agent is going to start asking you a series of questions about your client. If your client is in crisis or it's an emergency situation where you can't necessarily sit through the phone for like another 2-3 minutes to answer all of these questions, just answer I don't know or unknown for all of the questions. But if it's not a crisis, you have this information beforehand, or even if you don't have this information beforehand, you can go ahead and answer the questions to the best of your ability. Yes?
This looks different than the GC one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Can the access code be different than it is for the GC?
yes, yeah. So if your organization has multiple MOUs with us to access all of our different services, you just have to make sure that you're using the correct phone number, client ID, and access code for depending on your client. Yeah.
It'll be fun.
Yes. I can actually share with you instructions that I created for Ayuda, our organization, because our own staff have become confused with all the different phone numbers and client IDs, I can share with you the instructions I created. But yes, language line. Let's see. Okay. Do I go over this? Okay, awesome. So another service that's available to you, still through Language Line, but through another service that they use, is video remote interpretation, which you would use with a deaf individual, deaf and hard of hearing individual. There's an app or there's a website called Insight, which you can go to create I think an icon on your desktop that you can just then click and be given access to a video remote interpreter immediately. I won't be going over this process today, mainly because we are still waiting on Language Line to provide us with a couple of other things that we need before we can give you access to video remote interpretation. But I was told that within the next week or so, that process should be completed. So you'll all be receiving an email from our program with something that's called an authentication code and a device name, which are two things that you will need to connect to an interpreter. But in your folders, there are instructions about how to create that icon on your desktop, the tech requirements that you're going to need if you're working on a PC, which is really just webcam, mic, access to Wi-Fi. And of course, we'll be happy to also plan a webinar where we can show you how to download that. It's really easy. It takes maybe like 1 minute. Now, when you are using Language Line, please, when you connect to an interpreter, they'll be telling you their ID, their interpreter ID. We do recommend that you make note of that ID, take note of the date and time of your call and the language in case there's ever an issue with Language Line. If you do experience an issue with Language Line, you can either reach out to us or you can reach out to our representative and then copy us so that he can then address the issue. And having those pieces of information will make it easier for him, Joe Matthews, to track down who the interpreter on the call was, what the issue was, and how to rectify it. And it's important for you to copy us because we can make sure that the issue is resolved in a timely manner. And there might be other things that we have to coordinate with Language Line to make sure that the service is smooth as possible. But please document those things. When all else fails, just send us an email. You can also fill out a voice of customer form online and provide feedback to Language Line directly that way. But again, it'll ask you interpreter ID, date of the call, language, all those details. All right, any questions about telephonic or video remote? No? Okay, now we're gonna talk about document translations. Through our interpreter bank, you can translate client-specific documents, you can translate outreach materials, you can translate materials that you'll be using with your clients, as long as, you know, it's for a client that lives in Maryland or a client that experienced a crime in Maryland. As long as the client is eligible, you can submit requests for translating documents. And let me show you what that process is like. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they live in Maryland. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. As long as there's some Maryland connection, either they live in Maryland or they experience a crime in Maryland, they are eligible for our service. Okay. So to submit a translation request form, you do that through Salesforce as well, and there's a button called Translation Request. The form is similar to the interpreter request form in that everything in red is a required field, so if you don't have anything in that field, it's not going to let you submit your request. The first thing that you'll see right here is, or one of the first things that you'll see is the number of attachments that you wish to upload for a translation. So you'll see that you can upload up to 10 documents in one request. If you do have more than one document that you want to translate, I believe the system will only let you submit a request for one language. So if you wanted 10 documents translated into Spanish, you can do that. But if you wanted 10 documents, 5 of these translated in French and 5 of these in Spanish, the system will not let you do that. You'll actually have to submit another request. But for the sake of this example, I'm just going to select one, make it easier on ourselves. Then the request form is going to ask you who the audience is for this specific translation. And you'll have 3 options. Either this document is for a specific client, or it's an outreach document material, or a public education document, or you are preemptively translating office forms, like intake forms, evaluation forms. If it's for a specific client, then you'll get another set of questions. You'll be asked, is this document, what do you need this document in? If it's in English, you would type in, I need the document from English into Spanish. Say that I want this document translated into multiple languages. I can do that for one document, but I can't do that for like 2, 3, 4. Those would be separate requests. But say I also wanted this document in French. I would just select this button that's called Translate into Additional Language. There we go. Additional French. And then I can just keep adding.
You can click the button as many times as you want, languages, and then fill them in.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The other field that I want to go over is date, translation needed. You can just click into the field and this calendar will pop up, and you would just go to whatever month, whatever year that you'd want the translation in, click on the date. You'll see that this field automatically populates with the time that you submit your request. If you do need your document by a specific time, like say you need it by tomorrow at noon, go ahead and edit that field and let us know that you need it by that time. Otherwise, you can just feel free to leave the time as is, and we'll just assume that 5 p.m. is fine by that date. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That depends. I would say if you need a document translated into an indigenous language, contact us first before you submit your request. Because actually on Salesforce, if we've never encountered that language before through any of our services, Salesforce won't actually let you submit that request because we don't have a record of that language on Salesforce. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, just send us an email and we would have to communicate with our translators and see what they have access to. Yeah, we work with 2 translators, so. Unfortunately, no. We have a handful of former interpreters that we've lost touch with that did, I think, speak some Mayan dialects. But again, if you do have a need for an indigenous language interpreter, contact us. We might know someone, or we might have a relationship with an organization that maybe has connections to interpreters. I think in the past, we've referred people to a telephonic interpretation service that has Mayan language interpreters. But again, that's over the phone and not in person. And we can't necessarily vouch for their credentials. Yeah. But when in doubt, just send us an email and we'll work with you to try to find you something. Let's see. Anything else? Okay. If I'm submitting a request for outreach material, the request form is going to look a little different. It's going to ask me different questions. For example, one of those questions is going to be what the audience, which audience is going to be receiving the translation. And right here, you have several options. Now, if I select any of the DC options or the Maryland County option, Salesforce won't let me submit that request because I don't have an MOU to access those services. For everyone in the room, you should, for the most part, always select Maryland Victims of Crime receiving non-legal help of information. Because the Victim Services Interpreter Bank is for nonprofits that provide non-legal victim services. Yeah. Anything else that I should mention about the translation request form? I think the rest is pretty self-explanatory. Yeah.
You submit it as a PDF or and what form do you get it in?
Okay, so the question was, what format can you submit your documents for translation? I believe Salesforce will allow you to upload PDFs, JPEGs, maybe Word documents. We always ask that you submit them in a format that can be read by our translators, because they need to calculate how many words are in a certain document, and that's how they decide to quote us for that specific job. So as long as the format is an editable format, you should be able to, yeah, PDF, yeah. And you can request the format that you'd like, but most often than not, I believe that they return it in the format that they received it. So if they receive a Word document, they're gonna send you back a Word document.
Yeah, and there's a space for like special requests that you can put notes in there. The only other thing about the translation form is just that this first page is collecting all of the information, and then there's a second page where you upload the documents. I don't know if we can show them that. Is this like a is this the sandbox or
No.
just echo? But it's fine. We can.
Yeah, let me just do this real quick.
Yeah, or you could do outreach because there's fewer questions.
Oh, really?
You know, like that specific. Or even just cancel and start over and do outreach.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll show you the second page. So the first page is asking you how many documents you're going to be uploading. And then the second page will have taken that information into account and allow you to upload that number of documents. So if you say on here, I'm going to upload 3, it'll give you 3 places to upload documents. Yeah.
Cases where we have like support letters for integration and things like that are handwritten documents.
Yeah, we definitely send those to the translations agencies, and you know, sometimes they'll say that it's illegible and they can't do it, but most of the time they're able to handle it. Yeah, and keep that in mind when you submit it. Like, if you have the physical copy and you also have a scan and the scan's no good, like scan it again. You know, like try to get as good as copy as possible to send off to the translation agencies.
Yeah. All right. So once you enter in all of that information, you'll click next or save. I can't remember what the button is called. And then it'll take you to this page. And this is where you would upload your documents for translation. So let me just upload. And then done. My request has been submitted. You'll notice that I was only given the option to upload 1 document. That's because I selected 1 as my option. Had I selected 10, oh, this is nice. I forgot. It takes you to our website. Had I selected 10, it would have given me the option to upload 10 individual documents. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Yes. For a 1-page letter, I mean, I think the standard turnaround time is between 4 or 5 business days. We always ask that you submit your requests with enough notice to, 1, allow us to decide whether we can move forward with the translation depending on the amount of funding that we have. We might have questions for you also about the translation. So for 1-page documents, I think a week notice is fine. But if you have a lengthy document or you have a lot of documents that you want translated, if you can submit those 2 weeks in advance of when you actually need them, that's extremely helpful for us and for our vendors, because they have their own, procedures that they go through. Like, other than just translating the document, they do quality assurance. They edit the document, they review the document, making sure that everything is accurate. So as much notice as possible. All right. Any other questions about document translations? No. All right. Awesome. Okay. Now we're going to talk about data collection. My favorite subject. We kind of touched upon data collection throughout the 3 services, because through all those services you will be asked questions and we'll collect that data. And I think I already mentioned this, and I'll just mention it again. If your client is in crisis or there's an emergency situation, feel free to just answer I don't know or unknown to the questions. If this is the first time that you're meeting with this client and you need an interpreter to, find the answers to the questions, you can also feel free to answer I don't know or unknown to the questions. Or if you're using LanguageLine, you can ask the call agent to stay on the line, to connect you to an interpreter, and then with the help of the interpreter, you can ask the client these questions, and then the call agents can collect the answers.
So from personal experience, those are really, really
hard.
You are aware.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're like really probing questions, and if it's the first time you're interacting with a client, a lot of them are extremely inappropriate to ask a client.
Yes. Yeah. If again, it's up to you. If you think it's extremely uncomfortable for your client to answer these questions the first time that you're meeting with them, and it might put them off receiving services from you, just answer I don't know or unknown to all the questions. Unfortunately, with LanguageLine, there's no way for them to ask the questions at the end of the call. And we've explored other vendors and haven't found a vendor that really captures everything that we need. So for example, collect the amount of data that we need, answering the call, asking the questions at the end of a call. So again, just use your discretion, answer I don't know or unknown to all the questions. Yeah, these are the questions that the call agents will be asking you, and these are the answer choices, the acceptable answer choices. Yeah. That's what they'll be asking. There's another handout that's also called Instructions for LanguageLine that has some tips for connecting to an interpreter when you're receiving a call from a client or when you're making a call from a client to a client. So just keep those handy. I think for the most part, just to summarize what the instructions say, if you're receiving a call from a client, trying to communicate with the client, please hold, I'm trying to get an interpreter, and then quickly call LanguageLine and then conference in the client. Or if you're making a call to a client, you might want to call LanguageLine first and then call your client. So just some tips. All right, let me see. Any other questions about in-person, telephonic, document translations? I think we're going to end a little early, which is always nice. But if you have any questions at all after this presentation, you can feel free to send us an email at interpreterbank@ayuda.com. That account is monitored by all of our staff, so you'll receive a quicker response when you do email that account. And if one of us is out of the office, we'll have someone set to cover that can provide you with assistance. If you have questions about additional trainings about how to use our services, or trainings about language access, how to work with interpreters, you can contact either me or David directly. If you have feedback about our services, any of those 3 accounts, you can send an email. But yeah. Another thing that I will mention, I mentioned at the beginning, I'll mention again. If your organization has an app and MOU already with us, tomorrow you'll have access to Salesforce to submit in-person and document translation requests. You already have access to LanguageLine, and if you need a telephonic interpreter, you can access one today. And if your organization doesn't have an app and MOU, come find me or just send an email to Interpreter Bank, and we'll get that process started.
There's something in the other that mentioned that if like funds were, you ran out of funds, the still, how are we?
Yes. Yes. So in the scenario that we run out of funding and we can no longer provide these services for free, hopefully, I mean, we try to maintain communication, so you'll know far in advance of that happening. And if that happens, we have no funding, you have the option of either, going to a different interpreter service, or you can get services from us, and we have special nonprofit rates that I think are pretty competitive with other agencies, and you can still use our interpreters just at a fee.
And we don't foresee that happening. I mean, the fiscal year, the grant year that we're talking about is over at the end of September, and I don't think there'll be any problem there. It's never really happened for our larger grants like this one. It happens with our smaller grants. Like we have a Montgomery County grant for legal interpretation, and sometimes we run out of funding before the end of the grant year. But yeah, as Marilyn mentioned, we would give you plenty of notice, probably a month in advance. We'd be like, it looks like we're running low on funding. Maybe next month you won't be able to get in-person interpreters for free, but we would strive to continue to provide you language line access at the very least for free. So even if we because we have 3 services, the translations, the in-person, and the telephonic. So we try to manage everything so that we don't run out of all the services, And all of this is kind of moot because I really don't see it happening. It should be fine. I think through the end of this fiscal year, you would have the ability to get free interpretation.
Yeah. And like David mentioned, because we offer these 3 services, we try to make sure that you always have, at the very least, telephonic. So we might restrict document translations. Like if it's outreach, if it's preemptive translation of documents, we might decide not to approve those translations and to save the costs for in-person or telephonic interpretation. So if we were running out of funds, we would probably restrict document translations, but always make sure that at the very least you have telephonic and in-person. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Oh, sorry. One more thing. I forgot. Marilyn mentioned during the training the cancellation procedure. And I just wanted to reiterate that if you cancel with less than 48 hours notice, then we will pay the interpreters for sign language. Or if you cancel with less than 24 hours notice, we'll pay the interpreters for spoken language, just because that's sort of an industry standard. Interpreters, set their time aside, and if suddenly at the last minute they don't have that job anymore, they could have booked another job if they had known, So that's an industry standard. So we do appreciate it if you are able, particularly if it's like 4 ASL, 2 CDIs and 2 ASLs are coming to an appointment. Please do communicate with your client like 3 or 4 days in advance and say, hey, we just want to let you guys, let you know we have set up a team of interpreters for you. We're all set for the meeting on Friday. Are you still going to be able to make it? If you can do that extra step, it's really helpful because it is very unfortunate when at the last minute an assignment gets canceled and we have to pay for a bunch of interpretation that never really occurs.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that point, estimated duration. On the request form, you'll be asked, how long do you think the session will last? Be as accurate as possible because we do pay the interpreter for 2 hours, the estimated duration, or the actual duration, whichever is greater. Because again, like David mentioned, the interpreters, when they are accepting these assignments, they are foregoing other assignments. So if you estimated the session lasting 4 hours, but it only lasted 1, we'd still pay the interpreter for 4 hours because they set 4 hours aside to interpret. So just be as accurate as possible when you are submitting your requests. And if you actually need the interpreter for 4 hours, request those. But they get a different rate for out-of-state assignments as an incentive to accept assignments that happen in a state that they do not live in. Yeah. So if they live in DC and the assignment is in Maryland,
they would get paid. Yeah, they would get paid more for leaving their state, but not necessarily for traveling within the state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's something we would have to think about. We've had situations like that in the past where someone has needed an interpreter in Richmond, and we've been able to figure out incentives for the interpreters. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you again. This is a huge resource. Interpretation is just for so much of our program. And it's so important to have kind of, to know that there's a source for training, well-trained interpreters to work with survivors. I also saw this, I know this is a little extracurricular, maybe to your agenda, but I work up in Baltimore, but we have clients in PG and Montgomery County. I was just wondering if it would be possible for like people who are here to just quickly share further from what they do so we can network a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be great.
That's great.
We
Yeah.
would appreciate that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, we see a lot of new faces, so yeah. I guess we'll start.
My name is Elizabeth Martinez. I am a clinical social worker at the University of Maryland State Center. We work with survivors of human trafficking, both sex and labor.
Hi everyone, my name is Cassandra Chavez. I work for Baltimore Child Abuse Center. I'm a trans there, so I interview children 3 to 17